Hello everyone. So welcome to another series of our modern Indian history. So today we will be discussing about the land revenue systems of the British colonial state. It is very important to know about the history of land revenue system that the British colonial state had implemented in India because it had far reaching consequences in Indian history, Indian polity, Indian society, Indian economy and even Indian nationalism, because Indian nationalism had its roots in the British land revenue policies. So it is important to know in much detail about the British land revenue system. And not just that, there have been some questions, previous year question papers that came on British land revenue systems. So we will discuss a much more deeply about the British land revenue systems in this lecture series. So we will start our slides. The focus areas of this presentation would be that the British colonial state, after they came to India, they implemented certain revenue policies, and primarily they are known as the permanent settlement, the Ryotwari settlement and the Mahalwari settlement. So these three settlements are very important to know. Without that, we cannot understand the land revenue system. And actually these three revenue settlements, permanent settlement, Ryotwari settlement and Mahalwari settlement, were introduced in different parts of India by the British colonial state. So this was also the time when the British colonial state were politically occupying various territories in India. So these three settlements were implemented in three different regions of the Indian subcontinent. So we will be also discussing about its origins, the structure, the regions where it was applied, what were the impacts of these policies on the common farmers, the peasants, and in fact what were the long-term consequences. So rather than understanding the short-term consequences, we need to be also aware about the long-term consequences of these revenue policies, because it had impacted severely on the common farmers of India. So we will start our slides. So basically, to know about the colonial period, the colonial revenue policies, we need to have a glimpse about the pre-colonial period. What was the situation before the colonial period? That is something that we need to understand very carefully, because India during the pre-colonial period, before the colonial period came, especially in the northern part of India, India was ruled by the famous Mughal dynasty. And during the Mughal dynasty also, land was very central. Through land only you get revenue, you get taxes, everything. The state levies revenue and taxes through lands, and whatever agricultural produce that was actually cultivated on the land would be taken as a source of revenue for the state. But one thing we need to remember about the pre-colonial period is that in the pre-colonial period, the peasant or the cultivating tenant was given more importance. The peasant or the tenant had a large number of share, or lion's share, what we call, of the crops that were being cultivated, and state was just an agent. The king, who was the Mughal emperor, was just an agent. He didn't take all the properties that were being cultivated in the land. He just got a share of the crop that was being cultivated on the soil as a form of revenue. He didn't take the lion's share of the crop. In fact, the king was not the owner of the land. That is the main thing. Peasant was the owner of the land. The tiller was the owner of the land. And of course, there were the category called the zamindars. So zameen in Hindi and other Indian languages like Urdu and Persian, zameen means land. So zamindar. So the landlord. Basically the English translation of zamindar is landlord. But in fact, it is not the English understanding of landlord that was there in India. It is very difficult to translate the word zamindar, because during the Mughal period, the zamindars were not the owners of land. The zamindars were just the intermediaries. We call them intermediaries. Intermediaries means middlemen. So the peasants are of course working on the fields, and then there is the king. And to reach the king, the peasant cannot reach the king directly. So there will be the intermediaries, the middlemen, who will act as facilitators in paying the revenue to the state. Ultimate ownership is resting on the peasant. The lands are owned by the peasants. In fact, we know about the Pata deed and the peasant, when we discuss about medieval India and all, we know about the Pata deed, which was implemented by Alauddin Khilji, where the ownership of the land belongs to the peasant. The peasant can prove his ownership actually. but the state will get a share of that ownership or that product, right? That will go as revenue, and even the zamindars, who are the intermediaries, they will also get a partial share, but ultimate ownership is invested with the peasants. So this was a situation during the pre-colonial period. Why I told about the pre-colonial period is because in the colonial period there is a change that is happening. After the Britishers are coming and they are conquering India and they are establishing their administrative rule in India, what we see is that there's a slight change that is happening. You see that the ownership is getting transferred to the state, and in fact what we see is that it had disastrous consequences for the Indian economy, the Indian society, because state is getting more interest in capturing and appropriating the property or the crops that are being cultivated. So that is why it had long-term impacts on India. So the search for a permanent settlement, that is the heading of this slide. So what is the search for a permanent settlement? So we'll come to permanent settlement in a short while. When the British colonial state had expanded their territories, you see that they were thinking about the various possibilities of collecting revenue from the peasants. So what we see is that during the 1770s and 1780s, when they had actually established their rule in India, what we see is that they were trying to change the land revenue pattern. It was not the way that the land revenue system was practiced in the British period, where peasant has ownership. So in fact, they were letting out this land is becoming more commercialized. This is one thing we need to understand, that in medieval period, land was not a commercial product. Land was just an ownership product. So land is something that is owned by the peasants where he is cultivating. But during the colonial period, with the starting of the colonial period, land is becoming commercialized. Land is getting a commercial character, which we need to remember. And because of that, in the initial phases of their administration, what they're trying to do is that they're trying to give the land to the highest bidder. So whoever is paying more money will be getting the land. So this is a very significant shift or significant change from the pre-colonial period. So until then, it was not like land was being transferred to someone. Peasants could own the lands. But here what is happening is that when some middleman or when some zamindar or when some intermediary is coming and giving more money, that land is getting transferred to that zamindar, and he is getting more ownership power, more power of exploitation, appropriation, and what it is resulting is a form of agrarian slavery. I would call it agrarian slavery, because until then there was no notion of agrarian slavery. But with this, what we see is that these highest bidders, they are actually claiming ownership of the land, and the peasants or the cultivating tenants, they are being rack rented. There's a term called rack renting. So they are actually forced to pay huge rents to the zamindars. So earlier zamindars were just facilitators, but now the zamindars are becoming exploiters, and this is being facilitated by the colonial state. Rack renting, and peasants are facing lots of distress because of that. They are unable to pay huge revenue. There might be some crop loss, and especially the region of Bengal, where the colonial state had implemented its rule initially. Bengal had witnessed lots of famines during that time, and due to these famines, the peasants were unable to pay huge rents to the zamindars, who technically became the highest bidders, who technically became the owners. These peasants were unable to pay the rents, and because of that, these peasants also suffered from poverty and starvation, and there were lots of peasant crisis that was happening due to this policy. So what we see is that it is because of Governor General Warren Hastings, who is a very exploitative colonial Governor General. He didn't have a clear vision of how to improve the conditions of the peasants. In fact, he had started a very exploitative form of land revenue system where the land is being given to the highest bidder. But there is a slight change that is happening towards the end of the 18th century, where you see a new form of settlement, agrarian settlement is happening, because the colonial state always works in this way, because through this we can understand the two phases of the colonial state. The colonial state always shows a very, there's a word called paternalistic. What is paternalistic? So paternalistic means father-like. So the colonial state behaves like a benevolent father, a good father. What does a good father do? A good father will take care of his children. So likewise, the colonial state has occasionally showed this paternalistic attitude towards Indians. Simultaneously, what they will do is they will show their brutality or exploitation towards the common people. So this is their two phases. So even though they did this brutal phase of exploiting peasants, simultaneously towards the end of the 18th century, they are showing a paternal kind of attitude where they are starting a new settlement called the permanent settlement. In fact, it is connected to physiocratic or mercantilist view. So basically, this permanent settlement is also a slight change from the settlement of Warren Hastings, because it is started by a person known as Cornwallis, a governor general called as Cornwallis in the Bengal presidency. And you see that there the attitude is more like you want to create a class of landlords among the Indian zamindars. It is very important to know. It is a mercantilist view. So basically you want to create a landlord class, because remember that zamindars were not technically landlords. The zamindars were just facilitators who became exploitative, and now it is being viewed as a phenomenon where these zamindars are being conceived as a mercantilist class or a landlord class, wherein they are actually imitating the English model. So in England during that time, the system was that there was a set of landlords who were very entrepreneurial. There is a kind of business-like mind that these landlords in Britain had. So again, I told you the idea of commercialization of land is a British product. It is not essentially an Indian product. So what we see is that the British are trying to commercialize the system in India more, and you see they thought that among the Indian zamindars you can create a class of landlords who would be very aspiring, who would be very entrepreneurial, and who would actually improve the prospects of Indian economy. But it was a very brutal and exploitative form of system, right? It is a very toxic kind of system where peasants are getting suffered. We'll discuss about it in much later. But simultaneously, when we discuss about the colonial state, we tend to think that colonial state is uniform. They had only one structure, only one sort of opinion. No, they had multiple opinions also. They had their own share of disagreements. It is not that only one opinion of the colonial state prevailed. And of course, as I told you, the colonial state is spreading across India, various parts of India. And in different regions, they had different opinions. So the permanent settlement, the concept of permanent settlement was actually implemented in Bengal presidency in eastern India. So simultaneously you see another form of thought that is emerging in the southern part of India and western part of India. That is, southern part of India means places like Tamil Nadu, Andhra, and even Maharashtra, western part of Maharashtra. You see another form of land revenue concept that is evolving, which is called the Ryotwari system of land revenue. So Ryotwari system of land revenue is considered to be utilitarian and liberal. Permanent settlement is considered to be mercantilist and physiocratic, but Ryotwari is considered to be utilitarian and liberal. Why it is called as liberal? It is called as liberal because Ryotwari had a very liberal understanding of Indian society. So they thought that actually we should go back to the traditions of the Mughal dynasty where the peasant is the owner of the land. There shouldn't be any rack renters, there shouldn't be any landlords, there shouldn't be any merchants. Zamindars shouldn't have any agency. All agency should be invested with the peasants. And this was introduced by a person known as Thomas Munro. So Thomas Munro was actually a prominent colonial official in Madras presidency, and he actually had implemented this idea. So he had differences of opinion with the concept of permanent settlement, and he's saying that ownership of the land should go to the peasants. There shouldn't be any landlords, there shouldn't be any zamindars, and the peasants will directly pay the tax to the state. In permanent settlement, zamindars are the owners of the land and the zamindars are taking the ownership of the land and they're taking the produce of the land, and the peasants are getting nothing. The peasants are being given nothing. Zamindars are taking the lion's share of the land because they're the owners of the land, and a part of this will be given to the state as revenue. But here it's very different. Peasant is the owner of the land. So that is the idea of Ryotwari settlement, and in the word itself, Ryot means peasant. So it is intended to give welfare to the peasants, right? So that is how we need to understand the differences within the colonial state about two types of land revenue system, because it is implemented in two different regions. So permanent settlement, will just get into permanent settlement. So it was originally implemented towards the end of 18th century, that is around 1793. Permanent settlement was introduced by Lord Cornwallis, and he was a governor general. I had told you that the zamindars were the owners of the land. One important point that we need to remember regarding permanent settlement is that the land revenue that the zamindars had to pay to the colonial state was fixed in permanence, or we call it perpetuity. That is why it's in the name itself, it says permanent settlement, because one revenue is fixed. You cannot lower the revenue, you cannot increase the revenue. The zamindar has to pay that fixed sum every time to the colonial state. It is a very brutal form of method, because as I told you, when Warren Hastings came, Bengal had experienced famines. Bengal is a land that experiences famines many times. There will be weather changes, soil won't be suitable for cultivation. There will be multiple factors due to which the peasants won't be able to give the actual produce to the zamindar. If you fix the revenue permanently without lowering it or without increasing it, it will affect the common people, it will affect the common peasants, because sometimes the produce in the field will be very less because of famines or because of climatic conditions. And what will happen as a result? The peasants won't be able to pay their share of rent to the zamindars, right? And due to which what happens, the zamindars won't be able to pay the revenue to the colonial state, right? And because of that, this system completely was a failure. Permanent settlement was actually taken from England. As I told you, they wanted to create a class of landlords. It would have been applicable in England, because England's climatic conditions and weather conditions are very different from India. In England, it might work out, but it cannot work out in India. India has a very different soil, weather, everything. So it was an utter failure. And because of that, what is happening is that the zamindars are not able to pay the revenue. The peasants are in extreme starvation. The peasants are not getting any share, and zamindars are even subletting their lands, because they are technically the owners and they are not able to pay the revenue to the colonial state. Zamindars are also facing difficulties because they are not getting any profit out of the land. So what they will do with the land? They will sublet it. It's called subletting. What is subletting? So subletting means that ownership is getting transferred to another person. So there is a category called jotedar. So jotedar were people who actually increased. So the problem or the consequence of the zamindari settlement is that a large section of these jotedars, so jotedars were the middlemen. So many middlemen are arising, because what is happening is that the land is getting transferred from one zamindar to another middleman. So the lands are getting transferred to many middlemen, and the numbers of middlemen are increasing to an exponential rate. They are actually controlling everything. And this shows that the system was an utter failure in India. And who is at the receiving end? The peasants are at the receiving end. They are not getting anything. Everything is being exploited or appropriated by the zamindars or the jotedars. And that is why I told agrarian slavery. So this idea of agrarian slavery is continuing even during the permanent settlement, and that's why it was a failure. So this is the same thing that I mentioned to you, that Cornwallis had thought of creating a class of improving landlords, entrepreneurial landlords, which was an utter failure actually. And it was a change from the Mughal period. So yeah, absentee landlords, that term is urban absentee landlords, who is also known as jotedars. And one more thing is there, little agricultural knowledge. So these middlemen who are coming up, they don't have any knowledge about the land. They are completely ignorant about the landscape. That is why it's known as absentee. Who knows the land very well? Who will know the actual fertility, cultivation, aspects of the soil? The peasants are the owners technically. They will know about all these. But what is happening is that so many absentee landlords or jotedars without any knowledge about the soil are taking away the land. So that's the term, absentee landlordism. There is a sort of absentee landlordism that is happening, which is very different from the idea that was there in England, right? It was not applicable in India, and they had a very brutal law that's called a sunset law, where the zamindars had to pay the revenue on the sunset of a particular day, that fixed revenue on the particular day. And if they failed to do that, that land gets transferred to another person who is also an absentee landlord, right? So likewise, these lands were auctioned off to so many middlemen, and it was a complete, utter failure in that sense. And you see also the class of money lenders evolving. It is very important to speak about money lenders and some merchants. So along with the jotedars, along with the absentee landlords, you see that because the peasants are forced to pay rent to the zamindar, what they will do? They will collect money. They will take money in debt. And as a result of it, you see a class of money lenders also evolving. And these money lenders are also exploiting the peasants, because the peasants are forced to take money from the money lenders in debt, and the peasants have to pay back the money to the money lender, and the money and the debt keeps on accumulating and increasing. So you see that it was a very exploitative system. The zamindari system, also known as permanent settlement, was a completely exploitative system, where the peasant is not getting anything. Money lenders and absentee landlords are taking everything from the peasants, and it's ultimately the colonial state is benefiting from that, because revenue you have to somehow deposit it to the colonial state. Revenue should reach the colonial state. Zamindars will force the peasants to pay rent, and these peasants actually take money from money lenders, and the money gets deposited to the colonial state, but the peasants have to pay money back to the money lenders. So they are being forced into a state of agrarian slavery due to this permanent settlement. So that is why it was a failure, and it had its own share of criticism, and that is why the Ryotwari system also emerged, because when you see the timings of permanent settlement and Ryotwari settlement, there is almost a 20-year gap or 25 years gap that is happening, because permanent settlement is being implemented during 1796 and Ryotwari settlement is getting implemented around 1815. So almost a 20-year break is there, and this is also the time when certain colonial officials such as Thomas Munro and a person known as Elphinstone are actually criticizing the permanent settlement, and they are saying that to change the system, you have to give actual ownership of the lands to the peasants. There shouldn't be any intermediaries, there shouldn't be any middlemen, and the state only have to collect taxes from the peasants directly. So that is how the Ryotwari settlement was actually implemented in the Madras presidency, and the Ryot, who is also the peasant, will be the owner of the land. So it is a kind of revival of the Mughal tradition or the Mughal practice that was there. In fact, there is a thing that I also want to mention, a historical detail that I want to mention, that you might be aware of this Tipu Sultan, right? Tipu Sultan, who ruled Mysore, right? So Tipu Sultan actually had gotten inspired from the Mughal dynasty, because in fact Tipu Sultan had implemented this idea of Pata, land deed, where the peasant will be technically the owner of the land. And in fact, this was a Mughal way of administration. Even it goes back to the Delhi Sultanates and all, the Pata deed, everything. So Tipu Sultan had actually implemented the Mughal form of administration, where the peasant is technically the owner of the land. And in fact, Tipu Sultan had ruled parts of Mysore and these regions, which was later controlled by the English colonial state. And in fact, English colonial state had taken inspiration from Tipu Sultan to implement the Ryotwari system. So there is a revival of the Indian form or Indian way of tax collection that was actually tried to be implemented during the Ryotwari system. Because in zamindari or permanent settlement, it is a British system, an alien or Western system that they were trying to implement in India. That is why it was not a success. It was completely a failure. But in Ryotwari, they are trying to implement the Indian way of revenue collection. But was it successful? That is a big question mark. It was actually not successful. So we will come to that. So basically, yeah, it was based on the soil type. So in Ryotwari settlement, they did lots of homework compared to the permanent settlement, because permanent settlement was a failure. So in Ryotwari settlement, what we see is that the land is being surveyed. So obviously, permanent settlement land revenue was fixed in perpetuity or permanence. But in Ryotwari settlement, land revenue was not fixed in perpetuity. That is the biggest change that is happening. So land revenue is based on the soil quality, the soil productivity, the soil fertility, right? So you're going deep into the soil, you're measuring the soil, you're assessing the soil quality, and based on the soil quality, only you are actually assessing or you're calculating the revenue that needs to be taken from the peasants, right? You're not fixing the land revenue like what you did in Bengal, where this is the land revenue, you have to pay on the sunset of particular day. It is not like that. So you see that there were lots of surveys, there were lots of measurements that were done on the lands in Madras Presidency, and you see a whole host of revenue surveyors coming out on the lands of Madras Presidency, surveying the quality of the soil, surveying the fertility of the soil, and based on that, they are assessing the land revenue, so that this was conceived as a process where the welfare of the peasant or the welfare of the ryot matters more, right? So it was a very good idea, but in practice, it actually didn't work. So it was applied in Madras Presidency, Bombay Presidency, and Berar, which is also part of Maharashtra, that region. And as I told you, lots of revenue surveyors, lots of officers were deputed to investigate the quality of the soil, based on which revenue demand was fixed. But the problem is that after surveying these lands, surveying these fields, the revenue demand was still fixed as very high, almost 45% to 55% of the land revenue from the productivity of the soil, from the crops of the soil, was fixed by the colonial state, and it was hugely high, due to which the peasants again had to suffer. So what is happening is that unlike permanent settlement, in Ryotwari settlement, they used to revise the revenue rates occasionally. It is not fixed. So due to which the peasants are also facing uncertainty, because sometimes revenue rates will be high, sometimes revenue rates will be very low. So revenue is fluctuating, and due to which the peasants are also uncertain. The peasants are not clear about how much they have to produce or how much they have to give to the state. So in a sense, the Ryotwari system also had made peasants into a difficult state because of the high revenues and the fluctuating revenue. And every time, here also you see the peasants are bearing the brunt, and it is connected to the idea of commercialization of land, because land is becoming a product, land is becoming a commercial product. That is the reason why in both these systems, peasants are the ones who are suffering. And again, in Madras Presidency also, you see the growth of moneylenders. So if revenue is sometimes fixed very high, the peasants have to take money from the moneylenders, and the peasants may not be able to meet that revenue demand, which is very high due to various conditions in the soil, right? And there are certain regions in Andhra Pradesh also which are very dry, where for instance the Rayalaseema region and all, which was part of the Madras Presidency, we call it ceded districts. So it was part of Madras Presidency where Ryotwari system was implemented. And you know about Rayalaseema, that Rayalaseema is one of the most driest, drought-prone region, which faces lots of famines, and the peasants will be unable to pay the huge revenue that the colonial state is imposing. Sometimes what is happening is that they are not going by the rule, even though they are surveying the land, everything, still the revenue is fixed as high. And that is why the peasants are not able to pay the revenue on time, and due to which they are borrowing money from the moneylenders, and the moneylenders are again becoming exploitative. A class of moneylenders is being created, due to which the peasants are again facing distress. So you see that both these systems were anti-peasant. It created a form of agrarian slavery. Now we will go to another system, that is Mahalwari system, which is also a land revenue system that was implemented in Western India, particularly areas like Punjab. And it is very important. Why Punjab? Because you see that Punjab was a very important place where the colonial state wanted a loyalty because Punjabis were considered to be very much loyal to the colonial state. So they wanted to sustain that loyalty among the Punjabis because they were generally loyal, and due to which they created a system called Mahalwari System, especially in the western provinces, where the unit of assessment is very different. If in permanent settlement it was the zamindar who was the center of attraction, in Ryotwari settlement if it's the peasant who was the center of attraction, in Mahalwari settlement the mahal or the village is the center of attraction. That is, a village is considered as a unit, and through that unit tax is collected from the village headman. So that time India was a land of villages, as you all know. During the colonial period there were not very few cities that were there in India during that time, especially regions like Punjab. There are agrarian belts where wheat is being cultivated, and there are so many villages, and these villages will have a village headman who will actually control the affairs of the village. So the village headman will be the head. He will be the one who will be collecting revenue from the crops and give it to the colonial state. So in Punjab they implemented this kind of policy mainly to get the loyalty of the Punjabis, and you see that the village was responsible for paying the revenue, and it's called kinship based co-proprietorship. So what is that kinship? Because in villages generally what you see is that families will be staying together, and the families will be connected by kin, means family relationship, blood relationship. So based on blood relationship you are owners basically, right? And you have to pay that revenue. So it is based on kinship, it is based on blood relation, that you are paying the revenue to the colonial state. Because in Bengal permanent settlement, zamindar wouldn't be related to your blood, he will be some random person who won't be connected to you by blood. But in Mahalwari settlement what you see is that the kinship based, the blood based, village based, relative based, family based kind of settlement is there, through which you are paying the revenue to the colonial state. So that is the difference with Mahalwari regulation. It was implemented by a person known as Holt Mackenzie in 1819. So it is much later than permanent settlement. What we see is that again, as I told you, the village headman is the main agent of that. He's playing a key role in collecting revenue, and again the land is being surveyed, and you actually periodically revise. It's not like again permanent settlement. It is somewhat similar to Ryotwari in that sense that land revenue is not fixed permanently. Land is being surveyed, and the land revenue changes occasionally based on the productivity, the soil fertility, weather conditions, etc. Right? So again you see lots of surveyors surveying the lands in Punjab and all to assess the revenue patterns, but then village headman will be the one who will be collecting the revenue and giving it to the state. So again it's the same thing, it's mainly to get the loyalty of the Punjabis that they implemented this Mahalwari settlement. But the thing is that again this policy also didn't work very well, because again it resulted in revenue extraction. Even though it gave prominence to welfare of the peasants, it didn't take the concerns of the peasants seriously. The concerns of the peasants were completely set aside, and again there is the problem of revenue extraction. High revenue demand was fixed on the lands, and this again, the people who are at the receiving end are the peasants. The colonial state is imposing huge revenue demands which the peasants are unable to meet, and they are not able to pay the headman. So again this is also affecting the farmers completely, right? So again, maximum stable revenue extraction. So the priority is extracting the revenue, not giving welfare to the peasants. Here also the same problem. That is why it also affected the peasants very much. So in these three policies, peasants are the ones who are suffering due to the colonial state and various middlemen and various money lenders and even the village headmen. That is how the structure is functioning. So I thought of showing a map to you where these revenue settlements were being implemented. So this is Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, eastern part of India, where the permanent settlement was implemented, and Bombay and Madras, where the Ryotwari settlement was implemented, and Punjab and UP, that is present day Punjab and Uttar Pradesh, where the Mahalwari settlement was implemented. So these settlements were implemented in different regions of India actually, right? That thing we need to remember. So we had analyzed the aspects of these three main revenue settlements. So we'll discuss about the impacts, and I might have highlighted it during the course of the presentation, but we'll do an overview of that. So chronic indebtedness, insecurity of tenure, periodic famines. So these things basically, whatever we discussed, that famines, indebtedness, peasants are indebted to the moneylenders, famines, starvation, and in permanent settlement, subletting of the lands to various intermediaries, middlemen are increasing, absentee landlord is increasing in permanent settlement, due to which peasants are suffering. In the case of Ryotwari settlement, it is the high revenue extraction that is happening, where even without intermediaries, high revenue extraction is happening, due to which peasants are not able to meet their demands, right? And failure to pay revenue meant loss of land rights. This is very, very, very important point that we need to highlight. What does it mean? It means that land is a commodity. Land is a product. Land is not something that you are owning. What is the idea of land? Land means the tiller of the soil, the people who are cultivating the land, they are the owners of the land. But what is happening is that land is becoming a commercial product through which the state is extracting revenue, which was not the case before the colonial state came. And due to which, what is happening? The rights of lands are taken away. This word rights is very, very, very important. We discuss about rights in the framework of constitution. Your UPSC aspirants, you will be discussing about rights in the framework of constitution. Right to speak, right to free speech, right to privacy, right to worship, right to practice any religion. Likewise, something is there called land right. So right towards land is being taken away with the coming of the colonial state, because land is becoming commercialized. Why you should pay revenue to the, why state should control the land? Why certain intermediaries or zamindars should control the land? Who is the one who should control the land? The peasants are the ones who should control the land. But here what is happening is that these middlemen and this colonial state are controlling the land. They are becoming the eventual owners of the land. And that is why the aspect of revenue is very important. The revenue demands are getting high. And who is losing ownership? Who is losing rights? The peasants are losing rights. They are not having any rights over the land. That is why I called it agrarian slavery. And commercialization of agriculture. Very, very important point. Connected to that, agriculture is getting commercialized. Until then, peasants only grew subsistence crops. What are subsistence crops? Like rice, wheat, sugarcane. Sugarcane still can be called a commercial crop to a certain extent. But maize, rice, wheat, you cultivate it, brinjal, you cultivate it, seed, oil seed, you cultivate it, you eat it. You use it for your daily consumption. That is why it is called subsistence crops. Until then, the system was like that. They never cultivated any commercial crop. But now what is happening? Because the revenue demands are fixed very high, the peasants are forced to cultivate commercial crops, because commercial crops give you more profit. Commercial crops like indigo, cotton, jute. Through jute you make bags, right? And even cloth also sometimes. So these are commercial crops. So commercial crops will give you more profit. So the state is forcing the farmers to cultivate commercial crops. Until then they cultivated only subsistence crops. So they have to cultivate commercial crops through which they'll gain more profit, and they can satisfy the demands of the colonial state to pay high revenue. So this is also something that is very important. Opium also. Opium also is a commercial crop. So due to which they are forced to cultivate these crops, through which they are facing so much of difficulties. And so due to which cotton is being cultivated in Maharashtra, Berar, and again we will be discussing about Indian national movement, where we discuss about the aspect of deindustrialization and all. It is connected to this, I mean it's a very deep topic, and indigo is being cultivated in Bengal and Bihar. We will be discussing about indigo rights, indigo resistance by Mahatma Gandhi in Champaran in much later lecture series. Jute is being cultivated in Bengal. So in various provinces you see the commercialization of crops, which is a result of the colonial revenue policies, and due to which the peasants are in a state of increasing vulnerability. They are suffering a lot due to this. What is happening in this is that in the global level, the prices of indigo, the prices of cotton are reducing. when the prices are reducing, the peasants are not getting anything. And along with that, coupled with that, the peasants have to pay huge revenue to the state. The peasants are not getting any profit because the prices are coming down, and due to which the peasants are suffering. But did the peasants stay silent? No, the peasants didn't stay silent. The peasants were very much furious because in Deccan, that is in Maharashtra, you see something called Deccan riots during 1875. Remember that this is also the period where the Indian national movement is also growing up, because in our later lecture series we will be discussing about how these economic policies of the colonial state had an impact on the rise of Indian nationalism, and it can be traced back to the exploitative land revenue policies of the English colonial state. So you see that peasants are increasingly getting agitated, and you see that in Maharashtra, the peasants are in fact inflicting violence on the moneylenders, because it reaches a tipping point where they are unable to bear this burden, and they are attacking the moneylenders, they are burning the deeds of the moneylenders. So there is this peasant unrest, or what we call as agrarian unrest, that is happening in various parts of India due to the revenue policies of the colonial state, right? This is very important to know about these aspects of agrarian unrest, because even not just in Maharashtra or Deccan that this is happening, this is also happening in Bengal. There's something called the indigo riots that also happening. Indigo farmers, especially during the 1850s and 1860s, are actually protesting against the moneylenders, against the zamindars, right? So there is this kind of protest that is happening, agrarian unrest that is happening among the peasants due to these very brutal revenue policies of the colonial state. So what is happening is that they are kind of resisting against these moves, and it had long-term agrarian consequences actually, right? And as moneylender is the center of rural exploitation, what we see is that due to these Deccan riots that are happening, the riots that is happening among the peasants, the agrarian unrest that is happening among the peasants in Maharashtra, the colonial state is forced to implement an act called Deccan Agriculturist Relief Act in Bombay Presidency. So when the peasants are resisting, they are attacking the moneylenders, they are burning the deed contracts, the colonial state is passing an act for the so-called welfare of the peasants. It's called Deccan Agriculturist Relief Act 1879 to solve this problem. Even in Punjab, they are implementing something called Punjab Land Alienation Act. So this is happening towards the end of 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that the colonial state is forced to implement certain acts because peasants are getting too much unsettled by these agrarian policies. And this is where the colonial state is, as I told you in the beginning, showing its paternal face that we are caring for the peasants. So we call it carrot and stick policy. You know what is carrot and stick policy? That the colonial state had always implemented. Carrot and stick means what? You're beating, through the stick you are beating, right? So the colonial state has this carrot and stick policy. They will beat the peasants, and when the peasants get frustrated, they will give carrot. They'll give some relief measures. So that is how the colonial state had actually functioned. And I think this is coined by the historian Bipan Chandra, if I am not wrong. But then this carrot and stick policy, that you beat the peasant with the stick, when the peasant becomes very uneasy, you give some carrots. Oh, please, I'm showing you this paternalism. So that is how it is not out of humanitarian concern that they are doing this kind of acts. It is because of the fear of the peasant unrest that they are implementing these acts. But it never solved the problems of the peasants. So why it is important to know about peasant grievances, land revenue policies and all is because it had long-term consequences for the nation of India. As I told you, in the later lecture series, we will be discussing about how Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the nation, had mobilized the peasants in Champaran who were forced to cultivate indigo. And the land, again, as I told you, is becoming more propertied, more commercial, due to which peasants are suffering. And the Indian nationalists are gaining inspiration from this. They are thinking that we need to mobilize the peasants, and Mahatma Gandhi also mobilizes the peasants in much later period. So we cannot see the British land revenue policies in isolation from the Indian national movement that is happening much later. It had shaped the idea of India also, because this is the beginning of how the nationalist feelings are also rising among the Indians, because it is connected to that. Even the revolt of 1857, which is happening, the Sepoy Mutiny, one of the major causes of grievance is the economic policies of the colonial state, which includes this idea of revenue settlements, right? So it had actually impacted the Indian peasants, the Indian society so much. That is why it's important to know about the land revenue policies. Plus, some previous year question papers were also related to the land revenue policies. We'll go into that. So, two questions that came are, one is in 2013 UPSC prelims. So, I'll read the question. With reference to the permanent settlement introduced by the British in India, consider the following statements. So, three statements are given. It recognized zamindars as hereditary owners of land. Is it correct? What do you think so? Yes, we discussed about that zamindars were considered as the owners of the land. They are implementing that English system on India. That is correct statement. The second statement is the land revenue payable to the government was fixed permanently. Yes, we discussed about that land revenue was fixed permanently. That is a correct statement. The third statement, peasants were guaranteed occupancy rights under the settlement. Occupancy rights means peasants could occupy. They had rights over the land, which is completely against the ethic of permanent settlement, because the permanent settlement only thought of cultivating or improving the landlord's situation, not the peasant situation. So that is a false option. First two statements are correct. UPSC prelims 2022, another question was asked. Which one of the following was the main objective behind introducing the permanent settlement? What was the objective of implementing permanent settlement? There are four options. A, to improve irrigation. B, to create a loyal class of landlords. C, to abolish intermediaries. D, to reduce land tax. Which one would it be? Through the lecture series, what did you understand? To create a loyal class of landlords. So regarding permanent settlement specifically, there have been two previous year question papers that came in UPSC. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It was a wonderful kind of reflection for me as well. And thank you so much. Bye.